Hi, welcome to this video. It's an introduction to VCE Latin Units 3 and 4. It's meant for students and for their parents, students who are starting their final year of school Latin. So welcome. My name's John Tuckfield. I've been a Latin teacher for, 37 odd years and pretty closely involved with the VCAA in a lot of the curriculum documents which they've done. So let's get on to it. The first thing is you need to familiarise yourself with the official VCAA pages. So the address is there, but it's easiest just to Google VCE Latin, and that should get you to the right spot. The Latin page includes lots of different things there. The study design, the advice for teachers, past exams and exams reports, and a few other things there. We're really going to focus on the study design, but you can have a look at the other ones, particularly the past exams and exams reports. I'd recommend you get into them in Unit 4. So about halfway through the year, you should start to be really reading through them in a fair bit of detail. Let's have a look at the study design. The study design is meant for teachers, but because the VCAA are quite open and transparent, they put it up on their website. And it's not a bad thing for you to be familiar with what's included in here as well. So the address is there, but just Google it. The first thing I'd always suggest is just make sure you're looking at the right one. Check the accreditation period and check that you're looking at the right version of it. This is the official guidelines by the VCAA, and it's what teachers have got to follow if they're going to be awarding students the VCE. Of course, teachers can add to it, can do extra things as well, but this is the minimum. Though, to be honest, the Units 3 and 4 are so chunky, there's not much time for adding little extras to it, not too much time for digressions. Let's jump into the study design in a bit of detail. The first section, to be honest, is pretty generic, so by all means have a read through, but it's mostly pretty straightforward stuff. Where it gets interesting, I think, is the cross-study specifications, so we're going to zoom in on them. The first bit it has is the grammar, so the prescribed grammar which you need to do. And they talk about accidents and syntax. So accidents is the endings, or the tables which you need to know. And syntax is the rules, how these words string together, how they're used, how they function, in order to make sense. So together, accident and syntax combine to equal the grammar of a language. Now, this is the list of all you're expected to know. It's not the list of all Latin grammar that there is. There are a few things outside this, but it's all that you're expected to know. It gives the limitations for the exam writers. So they've got to look at this list and make sure that they're not including things outside this. Of course, when you start VCE, you're not expected to know this. And even when you start Units 3 and 4, you won't know this list entirely, but you should have about 90% of it, 95%. And certainly by the end of the year, you've got to have all this under your belt. And that means having it in your long-term memory. So looking at these things and saying, yep, I know that, I've got that. So you can treat this as one big giant checklist for you. The first section which you can see there is really all accidents. Accidents of verbs, adverbs, and then it goes on for adjectives and pronouns. So all that you've got to know and you've got to memorise. Have all those. Nouns, I think I've cut off the top there. The case bit is where the syntax starts to fit in. So this is for the cases, for example. Not only be able to identify what case a word is, but you see there it's got different uses for it. So under nominative it says subject and complement. So you've got to be able to say, okay, this particular noun is a nominative case and it's being used as a complement. And if you don't know what that means, then that's a bit of homework for you. So very quickly, if you say Harry is a centurion, Harry is the subject, nominative. He's also the centurion, so centurion should be the same case, and we call that a complement. You've got to be able to identify what case it is and why that case is being used, and there's the official list of the different uses of the cases. So you need to get through and know this. your sentence and phrase type, most of these should be familiar to you. There might be a couple which you're not really sure of, but most of these you should be pretty familiar with. And again, you've got to be able to have all these under your belt and be able to identify them and explain them, or explain instances where they're used. 2 points down the bottom, phonology means pronunciation. And it says the pronunciation, they follow Sydney Allen's book, Vox Latina. And you don't need to buy a copy of Allen's book, but it's a terrific book on pronunciation, extremely detailed and very, very good. Pronunciation is important when it comes to the poetry, because if you don't get the pronunciation right, if you're a bit sloppy in your pronunciation, you're going to make mistakes in the poetry. You're going to get the metre wrong, the scansion wrong, and you'll probably get some of the literary techniques wrong. So the pronunciation is actually important there. The last point's a little bit confusingly worded. It simply means that you might recall that the Romans had only one symbol for both a V and a U. They didn't distinguish whether V was a vowel, an U sound, or a consonant, a W sound. And most textbooks, like Cambridge Latin course, like Oxford Latin course, make life easy for us. And when U is a consonant, they write it as a V. And when it's a vowel, they write it as a U. Some, like the Oxford Latin Dictionary, keep it as a U for everything. And you've got to work out whether it's a consonant or a vowel. All this last line is saying is they'll treat it the same way that Cambridge and Oxford do. So when U's a consonant, they'll write it as a V. When it's a vowel, they'll write it as a U. So it really means nothing to worry about there. The next on the prescribed specifics are the literary techniques. And these are ones that particularly for Unit 4, you need to know upside down and inside out. Some of these you will have covered in Unit 2, but Unit 4, you need to know them. So this is our list of all you're expected to know. It's a good thing because there's actually probably a couple of hundred of these different literary techniques. You've only got a selection of them, the ones that we see most in the Roman authors, particularly Virgil. So this is good because it gives a limitation for the exam setters and for when you're doing your SAC. This is what you're expected to be able to know. Now, I don't expect you will know all these now, but as you've gone through your study of Virgil in Unit 4, you will get to know them, and certainly by the end of Year 12, you need to have these totally 100% known. Also in this list, they include metre, so scansion. You should have done some scansion in Unit 2, but you might have forgotten about that. That's not a huge thing, but you need to refresh your memory and remember that scansion is going to be an important part in Unit 4. There's a bit of other stuff there too. Vocab gets a mention. Now, there's no set vocab list. And if you think, therefore, that means you don't have to know any vocab, then I guess in one sense you're right. But that means that you'd spend the whole of the final exam looking up words in the dictionary and not have time for anything else. So you'd pretty much stuff yourself. You need to have a fairly good working vocab. I'd recommend have a look at 2 lists. So there's a couple of lists that people have done of the frequency of words. So they've ranked words by their frequency in the main authors studied usually at school, people like Caesar and Livy and Virgil. And they're pretty good ones to start with. So one of them is by an Australian scholar, Kenneth Masterman, Masterman. So Kenneth Masterman, looking particularly at his first list, maybe his second list, and they're just the most common words. And if you know them, then that's going to be a really, really good start. Dickinson College in the US have also done a very similar kind of thing. So you should be able to find one or both of those, and they're good ones to have under your belt. You note the next point is dictionaries. You can have any dictionary you like. Print dictionary, obviously. So you can have, if you like, the giant Oxford Latin Dictionary. The problem with that is I think it's extremely expensive, and B, you'd spend almost all your time in the final exam flicking over pages to finally work your way to the answer, to the meaning. A pocket dictionary is perfectly fine. Don't write in it. If you write in it, write notes in it, then you run the risk in the final exam that one of the supervisors will confiscate it. And then it's just tough. You've got to do the exam without a dictionary. I know some students will work their dictionaries so hard in units 1, 2, and 3 and 4 that their poor old dictionary is actually falling apart and dying by the time they get to the exam. So they've got to buy a new one for that. But I actually think that's a good sign that you've got really good value for money out of that dictionary. Scene texts, it mentions here that over units 3 and 4 you should be doing 1,000 lines. Now about 350, 320 of them are going to come from the Virgil that everyone does in unit 4, and the rest of the lines are going to be spread between the text which you study in unit 3 and your unseens. You should be doing unseens pretty regularly, and all that will count to the total word length or line length, so line count. So you'll get there without any trouble. There's a reminder there too that you've got to do a different author for unit 3 to unit 4, so you can't double up. It would make life very boring at any rate. So make sure you're doing something other than Virgil in unit 3. So let's have a look at unit 3 in a bit of detail. Unit 3 they call a Latin prose author or Latin poetry. What that really means is that it's a scene text and it's the school's choice. So everyone can be doing whatever they want. You could be doing a bit of Livy, a bit of Cicero, a bit of Suetonius, whatever floats your teacher's boat. So perhaps your teacher will have a word to have a talk with you, or perhaps it's going to be something the teacher is particularly interested in. I always think that if the teacher is really passionate about the text, then they're going to teach it really well, and that's going to be in your interests. The focus of it is pretty interesting. It's a focus on grammar, content, and context. So if we have a look at the outcome for it and sort of work backwards from that, the outcome is 12.5% of your final score, so pretty substantial. And you read it through together as a class, so it's a scene text. You study the whole thing as a class, and then you've got to demonstrate your knowledge of the accents and syntax and understand the content, context, and purpose of the chosen word. So you'll be doing a test. Accents and syntax, so the grammar of it. And that normally takes the form of you'll be given a passage and maybe a word or a few words will be highlighted in that passage. And the question might be, identify the case of this noun and say why it's that case. Or it could be, identify the mood of this verb and state why it's that mood. Or maybe you've got to identify the verb form in full, third person plural, imperfect, active, indicative, or whatever. That's the accents and syntax part of it. The content is the pretty straightforward what's happening in lines 3 and 4. What we told about the character in line 5, something like that. Context are those background details, which are so important for understanding any kind of Roman work. So who's this particular character? What event is being referred to? It could be a bit of Roman culture or history that's being referred to. So all those little references you need to know. The last one, the purpose, is what's the point behind this text? What's the ancient author trying to tell his audience about what they're reading? What point are they trying to make? So that will need quite a bit of contemplation and thought from on your behalf. Next part we're looking at will be area 2, which is unseen. Hopefully you've been doing some unseens in units 1 and 2, and this obviously continues on. So unseen, as you know, translating a never before seen passage of Latin prose. The focus is on accuracy and fluency. So you want it to be accurate. You want to show that you understand how the grammar works, but fluent as well. So it can't be in stilted, horrible Latinese, halfway between English and Latin. Let's make it, proper English. You've got a SAC for that, again worth 12.5% of your final. And for that one, you've got to translate an unseen of about 90 words. Now, don't take this to mean that you've only do one unseen for all of units 3 and 4. You should be doing lots of unseens, ideally doing one a week to build up your skills, build up your practice in this. But this is the one that counts for the SAC. That's it for unit 3. You might notice there was no translation, no scene translation part on the first SAC. And that's because, really, if you're going to get those content questions right, who's doing what. And if you're really going to get the author's point, then you've already got to know that translation pretty well. So that's an underlying, that's a little hidden thing which you've got to get. Jumping into Unit 4 now, and that's all about epic poetry. And for that, we do selections from a book of Virgil's Aeneid. Now, the Aeneid, as you might know, the great masterwork of the poet Virgil, written during the reign of the Emperor Augustus. And it tells the story of a man, Aeneas, who's in Troy at the end of the Trojan War, and it's him escaping with some of his fellow Trojans, escaping from the fall of Troy, wandering through the Mediterranean, having numerous adventures, including getting shipwrecked in Carthage, landing in Italy, fighting the locals, and eventually winning the war there. And it's from these Trojan settlers in Italy eventually that you will finally, sort of generations later, get the ancient Romans. But it's the prehistory of the Romans, if you like. A hugely influential book and incredibly important. The book and the line, so the Aeneid is divided up into 12 their chapters, but we call them books. And the VCAA set what book you're doing. Each book's about 800 lines or so, and you'll do 320 of them. So the VCAA set out what your book is and what lines you're doing, but that changes annually. And the idea with that is to keep it fresh for the teachers. So the teachers become experts in Virgil, but don't go crazy by having to do the same lines year after year. So have a look at Area of Study 1, the content, context, and techniques of the Aeneid. So for that one, for the SAC for that, again, 12.5%. And again, it's after we've studied the whole thing as a class. So for this particular SAC, response to questions on a scene, passage, or passages with a total of about 50 lines. So you'll do about 320 lines of the book. And for the SAC, you'll get 50 lines from that selection. You won't know which 50 lines they are in advance. And you'll get questions about the content. So what's happening, what's going on. Pretty easy, I reckon. The accents and syntax, so the grammar of those lines, sounds awful, but it's actually pretty easy. Virgil's grammar is really pretty straightforward. The least interesting thing about Virgil is his grammar. Scarcely a subordinate clause in the whole thing, you'll be pleased to know. So that's not as bad as it sounds. And the prescribed lines in the context of the specific book and the Aeneid as a whole. So that's the background info which you need to know, and how your lines and indeed your book fit into the whole poem. So that's a much harder thing. For that one, you need to have really, really good notes on that. All those little background details. The literary techniques used in your lines. So remember that list we looked at earlier of the literary techniques? That's where this comes in. So the literary techniques. So you've got to be able to look and it will say, identify the literary technique used in line 3, or find an example of assonance in line 3 and comment on the effect of it. And the last part is the scansion. Use of hexameter. So it could be scan line 4 or scan lines 5 and 6 and comment on the effect of the meter. So this should help to frame the notes which you need to take on them. You need to be getting a good translation of it, which will help you for the content. Make a grammar note every time there's anything interesting or remarkable with the grammar, which frankly won't be too often. You need to note down all those little contextual details of how they fit in. You need to note the literary techniques. And I think for the best thing for that is to have a pen and paper copy and have lines drawn in different colours showing all the different things which are going on there. And use of hexameter, you need to be doing lots and lots of scansion. The good thing is scansion is really, really hard when you start, and then it becomes really easy the more you do it. So you'll be terribly slow for your first few tries, but you'll rapidly get quicker and quicker and better at it. The next part is still on our same bit of the Aeneid, and this time the focus is the themes and ideas. So we're looking for the understanding of the themes and ideas of the prescribed lines, right, our 315, 320 lines or so that we're doing, and the book that they're part of, and how they fit into the Aeneid as a whole. And for this, you need to know the historical, cultural, philosophical, and mythological background of the Aeneid. So again, that's another really big task. So what's going on? Themes and ideas is a very broad part of a very broad concept. So have a look at the characters, why they portray in this way, why do they act in this particular way, how do the gods work in this, what are the themes, what are the ideas. Now, as you go through your study, you'll find that actually it'll narrow itself down to really just probably 3 or 4 different major themes which are happening in your book. So it's not going to be as bad as it might seem. But don't just focus on the lines that you're doing. Remember, you're doing lines as part of a whole masterwork. So you've got to get an idea of that thing. And I would suggest get a copy of the whole poem in translation. There's an excellent, I'd recommend the Penguin translations. They're always very, very reliable. There's a website called Poetry in Translation, which has a very good translation of the Aeneid. It's actually not all that long. Each book really only takes about a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes to read. It's not a huge read. So our SAC for that one, again, our 12.5%, and this time it's an essay. 400 to 500 word extended response, essay, on the themes, ideas, cultural, historical background of the prescribed text. So you'll do it in class, and you'll get a topic or maybe a choice of topics, I don't know, 400 to 500 word extended response on it. So you need to do a good lot of thinking and practice beforehand. The last thing we'll have a look at is the end of year exam. I propose to, I'll perhaps do another video a little bit closer to the time on some ideas about preparing for the exam, but just an overview so you know what's coming up. This is last year's exam, by the way. It'll be in November sometime. The timetable hasn't come out yet. It'll be 2 hours plus 15 minutes reading time. And that reading time is really important because in Latin, you're allowed to use your dictionary during reading time, which means you can get a fair bit of the unseen done during that. It's made up of an unseen with 45 marks. Again, 90 words. It'll be pretty hard. And the rest of the exam is all the Aeneid, just like we've already been studying for Unit 4. Comprehension on content and context, worth 15 marks. Note there's no grammar in this bit, just content and context. And they're all going to be short answer questions. Literary techniques, I think, is a harder part of it, and that'll include some scansion. There's always a couple at least of scansion questions for that one. And then there's going to be an extended response. Whoops, that should say 20 marks, not 15. My apologies. Extended response on themes. And that's, again, going to be pretty similar to what you've done for the SAC, but in a much more rushed version of it. So that's your overview of Units 3 and 4. Any questions, chuck them in the comments, and any more videos you'd like to see. I'm thinking of doing one on scansion, one on perhaps some grammar topics if people have got them. And just a final blatant plug, if you go to my website, Latin Study Resources, I've got some great resources which you can use to help with your study of Units 3 and 4 Latin. But good luck, enjoy the year, and have a great time.